She was 34 years old. She stood 5'2" and weighed 120 pounds, and had worked at the same library for 9 years, and had never, in 9 years, returned a single book late. On the afternoon of October 17, 1981, she locked the front doors of Weston Falls Elementary School library at 4:45 p.m., said goodnight to the custodian in the hallway, and walked to her car in the faculty parking lot. She was never seen alive again. That is not a story about a woman who wandered somewhere she shouldn't have. That is a story about a man who had decided, months before that October afternoon, that Margaret Aldrin's answer was going to stay no, and that he was not prepared to accept it. And it would take 43 years, a demolition crew, and 4 embroidered letters on a square of cotton cloth to put a name to what he had done. But before we get to that handkerchief and what those 4 letters meant, you need to go back to Weston Falls, Indiana, in the autumn of 1981. Because to understand what was lost, you first have to understand who Maggie Aldrin was. Margaret Ann Aldrin, Maggie to anyone who knew her well enough to use it, had been the school librarian at Weston Falls Elementary since 1972. She had grown up 11 miles east of town in the small community of Corbin, the oldest of 3 children, and the one who had always been most reliably where she said she would be. She held a degree in library science from Indiana State University, drove a used Ford Pinto in a shade of orange vivid enough to be spotted from a distance, and had been renting an apartment on Maple Grove Road for 6 years, making it, through the deliberate effort of a woman who lives alone and intends to make something of it, into a place of warmth and order and a great many bookshelves. She owned a cat named Ptolemy, after the geographer, as she would explain to anyone who asked, because she believed in knowing where you were. She baked bread on Saturday mornings. She wrote letters to her younger brothers, Dennis and Alan, on the first Sunday of every month without fail. Dennis was 29 in October of 1981. Alan was 26. Both lived within 2 hours of Weston Falls. Dennis had a daughter who had just started walking. Alan had been married the previous spring, and Maggie had been at the wedding in a yellow dress. A photograph from that day became the image her family used on every flyer, every newspaper appeal, every reward poster for the decade that followed. As a librarian, Maggie had one habit that her colleagues described as charming, and that children who checked books out of Weston Falls Elementary sometimes mentioned for years afterward. She pressed wildflowers between the pages, dried violets, Queen Anne's lace, small sprigs of goldenrod, tucked at no particular interval inside the books she catalogued and returned to circulation, so that a child opening a library copy might find a small pressed flower placed there quietly, without announcement, as a gift from someone who believed reading should feel like discovery. The custodian who worked her building for more than a decade said he found one inside a Hardy Boys novel in 2019 and kept it on his desk. In October of 1981, Weston Falls smelled like turning leaves and wood smoke, and the diesel exhaust of the corn harvest running into evening. Ronald Reagan was 8 months into his first term. Touch-tone phones were slowly replacing the rotary dials that had lived in every Indiana kitchen since the 1950s. But most households in Weston Falls still had the old kind. A Sony Walkman had appeared in the electronics shop window on Main Street that September and attracted more curiosity than buyers. The Weston Falls Courier was how people learned what was happening in their town. Read at the kitchen table every morning, folded and left on the counter for whoever came next. In September of 1981, Maggie had applied for a reference librarian position at Indiana University's undergraduate library in Bloomington. Her supervisor had written a letter of recommendation that Maggie had not been shown, but which, by the supervisor's own account in later interviews, described her as the finest natural librarian she had encountered in 20 years in the profession. The interview was scheduled for October 24th. Maggie had told Dennis about it the week before she vanished. She had been trying not to be too hopeful. She had not been succeeding. She never made it to the interview. She was gone before the week was out. On the afternoon of October 17, 1981, Margaret Aldrin locked the library at 4:45 p.m. and drove to Grant Street. At 5:15 p.m., she was seen by two separate witnesses inside Fenwick's family pharmacy, the corner drugstore at Grant and Dewey that had been operating in Weston Falls since 1961. The first witness, a woman named Helen Bauer picking up a prescription, remembered Maggie because she had waved at her from across the counter. The second, a teenager named Keith Stroud waiting outside for his mother, saw Maggie exit the pharmacy's front door at approximately 5:25 p.m. and walk toward the parking on the building's side. After 5:25 p.m. on October 17, 1981, no verified witness ever placed Margaret Aldrin anywhere. At 7:30 that evening, Dennis called from Carmel and let the phone ring 12 times. At 8 p.m., he called Alan. At 9 p.m., Alan drove to the apartment on Maple Grove Road. Ptolemy was crying from the other side of the door. Alan tried the knob. It was unlocked. He went inside. Maggie's pocketbook was on the kitchen table. Her keys were beside it. Her tan wool coat hung on the hook by the door. The bread dough she had been planning to bake that weekend sat in a ceramic bowl on the counter, still covered in a dish towel, filling the kitchen with the smell of yeast. The Ford Pinto was not in the lot. It was found the following morning on County Road 12, 4 miles east of town, pulled to the gravel shoulder with the driver's door closed and the keys gone. The Weston Falls Police Department opened a missing persons investigation on October 18, 1981. The lead detective was a 50-year-old man named Edward Marsh, 22 years on a small-town force, working with a jurisdiction, a budget, and a forensic capability all considerably smaller than what the case required. The first week produced 61 interviews and a canvass of Maggie's known routes, and no physical evidence that told him anything definitive about what had occurred between 5:25 p.m. and whenever the Pinto arrived on County Road 12. The initial investigation proceeded along 2 tracks. The first centered on a man named Curtis Vane, 44 years old, a seasonal worker from outside the county who had been observed near Grant Street that afternoon and who had a prior record of disorderly conduct in 2 neighboring counties. Vane was brought in for questioning in the second week. He had no alibi and gave inconsistent answers. Investigators focused on him through November. By December, a witness placed him in a bar in Muncie at 6 p.m. On the evening of October 17th, corroborated by a bartender who recognized him. 6 weeks had been spent on a man who had not been there. The second track led the investigation to a name it identified, weighed briefly, and moved past. Harold Fenwick was 38 years old and the proprietor of Fenwick's family pharmacy, the business his father had founded and Harold had taken over in 1973. He was a deacon at First Methodist Church. He sponsored the local Little League team. He knew every customer by name and the names of their children and, in many cases, their dogs. He was the kind of man whose presence in a small community had grown indistinguishable from the community itself. A fixture. A given. A man about whom suspicious questions did not arise because he had already positioned himself as the answer to too many ordinary ones. He had also, according to Carla Whitmore, a colleague of Maggie's at the school, made persistent social advances toward Maggie over the 18 months prior to her disappearance. Advances Maggie had declined with increasing directness. Maggie had mentioned it to Carla twice, describing it as something she was managing. Carla did not volunteer this information until Detective Marsh's second interview with her in November. by which point Harold Fenwick had already been interviewed once and provided a full account of his October 17th evening. Dinner at home with his wife. A phone call to his mother in Fort Wayne at 7:00 p.m. That appeared in the phone company's billing records. His wife confirmed the dinner. His mother confirmed the call. Marsh noted the advances on page 83 of the case file. He recorded them as contextually relevant and evidentiary insufficient. He moved forward. Margaret Aldrin's body was never recovered in 1981 or in the years that immediately followed. By early 1982, the investigation had exhausted its productive leads and settled into the particular stillness of a case that has nowhere left to go. Marsh retired in 1989. The file passed through 2 reassignments. The Courier ran anniversary pieces in 1986 and in 1991. Dennis and Allen funded a reward that was renewed annually through 1998 when the family, worn down in the way that only long grief achieves, quietly stopped renewing it. By 1987, 6 years on, Harold Fenwick had expanded his pharmacy into the adjacent storefront on Grant Street, knocking through the wall between the 2 properties and building out a back room for pharmaceutical storage and processing. The renovation had required a county permit, duly issued and recorded. The permit noted the structural work in its standard form. No investigator ever read it in connection with the Aldrin case. There was no reason in 1987 to make that connection. By 1993, Dennis Aldrin's daughter, the one who had just been learning to walk in October of 1981, was 12 years old and had been told a careful, partial version of what had happened to her aunt. Dennis kept a photograph of Maggie on the wall beside the kitchen table. He never took it down. He had stopped explaining it to guests years before. People who sat at his table long enough came to understand it on their own. By 2001, the Weston Falls Elementary School Library had been renamed the Margaret A. Aldrin Memorial Library. The ceremony was attended by the mayor, both brothers, and 11 former students who had driven back to Weston Falls from other states to be there. The custodian who had worked the building since 1979 spoke last, briefly, and held up a pressed violet he had found inside a library book. The room went very quiet when he held it up. Harold Fenwick sold the pharmacy in 2008 and retired to a senior residential community in Evansville. By 2015, he was 72 years old and played cards every Tuesday with the same group of men. He had a framed photograph of the old corner store on his dresser. He had a daughter in Indianapolis who called him every Sunday. He had lived in ordinary light for 34 years. Every case on this channel is built from weeks of research, reading old files, finding the people who never let go, tracing the thread through the years it spent in the dark. If that work matters to you, please take a second to like and subscribe. Leave a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from tonight. We read every one. Now let's get back to Maggie. The building that had been Fenwick's family pharmacy was purchased in early 2024 by a developer who planned to convert it into mixed-use commercial space. Renovation began in March. On the morning of April 9, 2024, a member of the demolition crew working in the expanded back room, the addition Harold Fenwick had built in 1987, began removing the false interior wall, constructed to conceal the building's original exterior brick. Behind the drywall and a layer of old fiberglass insulation was the original brick face of the 1961 building, wedged into the gap between the brick and a wooden support beam, in a space narrow enough that it could only have been placed there deliberately, and only during the construction of the false wall, was a folded square of white cotton cloth. The site supervisor called the Weston Falls Police Department at 10:47 a.m. The detective who arrived was a 44-year-old woman named Cora Parrish, 16 years on the force, who had grown up 3 blocks from the elementary school where Maggie Aldrin had worked. At age 8, Cora had checked out her first library book from Maggie Aldrin's library. Maggie had issued her first library card, a fact Cora's mother had marked by keeping the card in a plastic sleeve in a photo album that was still on a shelf in her house. Cora Parrish had known the Aldrin case her entire professional life, the way you know a cold case in a small town. Because it was always there, named on the library plaque, present in the anniversary articles, woven into the specific air of the place where you grew up. She held the cloth up to the light from the open doorway with gloved hands. Turned it. Read it. A handkerchief, the old-fashioned kind, hemmed in white thread at the borders, folded to a 4-inch square. In the lower corner, embroidered in dark blue thread, was a monogram arranged in the style common to gift sets of the late 1970s, 3 letters in a diamond formation, the central letter larger. H at top, F at bottom, N in the center, slightly raised and prominent. H.N.F. Harold Norman Fenwick. The cloth was dark at its center, a stain aged to deep brown over 4 decades that the forensics laboratory in Indianapolis confirmed within 8 days as human blood. The DNA extracted from the fibers, a process that had not existed in any workable form in 1981, but that by 2024 could be performed reliably on biological material decades old, was compared against a reference sample provided by Dennis Aldrin, now 71 years old and living in retirement in Carmel. The comparison required 4 days. The blood belonged to Margaret Aldrin. Harold Fenwick was 81 years old and finishing breakfast in his residential community's common room on the morning of May 2, 2024, when a staff member came to tell him there were 2 people at the front entrance asking for him. He rose from the table with the measured pace of a very old man and walked to the lobby. He was informed he was under arrest for the murder of Margaret Ann Aldrin. He stopped walking. He looked at the detective across from him, at Cora Parrish, who held his gaze without looking away, and said nothing. He was handcuffed with the care extended to elderly suspects, and was walked out of the building into a May morning that was warm and bright and smelled like fresh grass. His daughter in Indianapolis did not believe it. Then she read the evidence summary her attorney provided. After that, she did not speak publicly again. The monogrammed handkerchiefs had been a Christmas gift to Harold Fenwick from his mother in 1979, a set of 6. His initials embroidered in dark blue in the lower corner of each. A photograph taken at the Fenwick family Christmas gathering in December of that year, located by investigators in a collection of family photographs obtained during the search of Fenwick's Evansville residence, showed Harold holding up one of the handkerchiefs for the camera, smiling. The blue thread. The 3-letter diamond. The same monogram that had spent 37 years in a wall on Grant Street. The prosecution's case at trial rested on the DNA identification, the monogram match, the physical placement of the handkerchief in a space accessible only during the 1987 renovation, and a documented pattern, letters, phone records, a notation in a colleague's diary, and Carla Whitmore's testimony, establishing the nature of Harold Fenwick's pursuit of Maggie Aldrin and her repeated refusals. The defense challenged the DNA chain of custody and proposed alternative explanations for the cloth's presence. The jury deliberated for 3 days. They returned a unanimous verdict: guilty of murder in the first degree. Harold Fenwick was 82 at sentencing. He received a life term. He made no statement. He looked straight ahead, breathed steadily, and was walked from the courtroom at his own pace, which was slower now than it had been in any lobby or any October afternoon in 1981, when the world was still arranged around his certainties. Dennis Aldrin was 72 years old when the foreman read the verdict. Alan was 69. They sat in the front row of the gallery with Cora Parrish one row behind them, and they received the verdict the way men receive things they have been waiting for so long that the waiting has become structural. They do not quite know how to exist without the weight of it. Dennis told the Courier reporter afterward that he had driven directly from the courthouse to Weston Falls Elementary. He had walked to the library named for his sister and sat down in one of the small chairs at the children's reading table for a long time. He did not explain why. He did not need to. The renovation of the old pharmacy building resumed in the autumn of 2024. The back room was documented, cleared, and incorporated into the new floor plan. The original 1961 brickwork, once hidden behind the false wall, was restored and left exposed, incorporated into the design, as the developer had originally planned, because there was something that felt right about letting the old walls stay visible. Margaret Aldrin would have been 77 years old in the year Harold Fenwick was convicted. She never went to the interview in Bloomington. She never became a university librarian. She never saw Dennis's daughter grow up, or attended another family wedding beside Alan, or pressed another wildflower between the pages of another book for another child to find one morning in the middle of a story. All of that was what the handkerchief in the wall had been placed there to conceal. Not only a life, but the daily accumulation of it, the Saturdays and Sundays, the bread rising in the bowl, the cat on the windowsill, the first library cards issued to children who would grow up and drive back across state lines to sit in a room and hold up a pressed violet for the people gathered there. But the wildflowers remain. They remain in the books that passed through Maggie Aldrin's hands during 9 years of quiet, deliberate work, still turning up occasionally, dried and small and improbably intact, between the pages of books that have been checked out and returned and checked out again for decades since she last touched them. The kind of gift you place somewhere because you believe it should be found. Because you believe that discovery is what reading is for. Because you believe, the way a woman who baked bread on Saturdays and wrote letters on Sundays and pressed flowers into pages for children she might never meet. That something given without announcement, in good faith, in the expectation that it will someday be found, always is. We ask this of every case. What does it tell us that the only piece of physical evidence capable of solving this case was placed in the wall by the man who committed the crime, during a renovation that no investigator thought to examine, and that it survived there for 37 years until the building came down? What do you think Margaret Aldrin's case says about the particular danger of men whose community standing functions as a kind of permanent alibi? And what does it mean for justice that the break in this case came not from a new technology or a new witness, but from an ordinary crowbar catching a hollow wall on an ordinary Tuesday morning? Leave your answers in the comments. We read every one. Justice found Margaret Aldrin after 43 years. It found her because a demolition crew pulled down a false wall, and because a detective who had been given her first library card by the woman at the center of the case walked into that back room, held the cloth up to the light, and understood immediately what she was looking at. Stories like Maggie's are the reason this channel exists. If you believe the truth is worth finding no matter how many years it is spent in the dark, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.